The night of February 16th to 17th, 1944, brought temperatures that could kill a man in hours. Across the frozen Gniloy Tikich River, tens of thousands of German soldiers and foreign volunteers who'd sworn to destroy communism hurled themselves into Soviet machine gun fire. The riverbanks became a graveyard of shattered armor and frozen corpses, as roughly 56,000 trapped men gambled everything on one suicidal charge to escape what history would call the Little Stalingrad. At the heart of this disaster was the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, an elite formation that would lose half its strength before dawn. Copenhagen, 1941. You're 20 years old, standing before a recruitment poster. The bold text doesn't call you a subject of occupation. It calls you a warrior, a defender of European civilization against the communist tide sweeping from the east. The 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking is recruiting. They want Danes, Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians, and Finns, men willing to join what Nazi propaganda framed as a continental crusade to save Western culture. Thousands signed up. By 1944, Wiking had become the symbol of Hitler's dream, a pan-European SS force of ideologically unified soldiers bound together by their hatred of Bolshevism. But here's where propaganda meets reality. Despite its reputation as a multinational legion, foreign volunteers made up less than 20% of Wiking's actual strength. The overwhelming majority were German personnel. This wasn't the European army the posters promised. It was a German SS division, using foreigners for propaganda value. And those foreign volunteers, their reasons for joining were far more complicated than recruiters acknowledged. Some, like Danish officer Knud Berger Martinsen, genuinely believed in the anti-communist cause. They saw themselves as defenders of Western values. Others joined for adventure, regular pay, or to escape the limited opportunities of occupied territories. Post-war interviews and wartime letters reveal a division plagued by internal friction. Language barriers caused chaos in combat. Morale problems spread. Desertion rates among certain national groups ran disturbingly high. Martinsen himself would later describe the loneliness and growing doubt that consumed foreign volunteers as they watched their friends die in what increasingly felt like Germany's war alone. The recruitment promise was elite status, superior equipment, and the most critical assignments. But what they actually received was something else, entirely. By early 1944, Wiking found itself dangerously overextended along the crumbling Eastern Front. The division was ordered to hold vital river crossings near Cherkassy and Korsun in Ukraine. They occupied an exposed salient, a bulge in German lines that jutted dangerously into Soviet-controlled territory. Marshal Ivan Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front and General Gniloy Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian Front were preparing to close the trap. They were planning a double envelopment that would encircle roughly 56,000 German troops, Wiking among them, in what would become the Korsun-Cherkassy pocket. The European crusade was about to become a frozen death trap. Study a map of the Eastern Front in January 1944, and one feature demands immediate attention. A dangerous bulge pushing into Soviet-held territory near the Ukrainian towns of Korsun and Cherkassy. Intensity, medium. This wasn't merely poor positioning. It was a catastrophe in waiting. Army Group South had been stretched impossibly thin across Ukraine. Relentless Soviet winter offensives had hammered their positions. The Red Army's successful Dnieper River crossings had shattered German defensive lines. The same Wiking division promised glory as Europe's defender now faced a hopeless task, holding critical crossings along the Dnieper and Gniloy Tikich Rivers with defensive lines so extended that entire sectors lay virtually unprotected. The salient was a textbook case of military overreach. Roughly 56,000 German troops held these positions. The 11th Army Corps, Wiking, 6 infantry divisions, and elements of the 1st and 16th Panzer divisions. Any competent staff officer could see they were perfectly positioned for encirclement. Soviet planners recognized it immediately. Marshal Ivan Konev commanded the 2nd Ukrainian Front, while General Gniloy Vatutin led the 1st Ukrainian Front. Together, they began orchestrating what would become a masterpiece of operational warfare. a massive double envelopment designed to trap the entire German force in a steel ring. This wasn't improvisation. It was methodical and calculated, supported by intelligence capabilities the Germans fatally underestimated. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft mapped German positions with precision. Radio intercept stations captured and decoded Wehrmacht communications, revealing unit strengths, supply levels, and defensive weaknesses. Local partisan networks delivered real-time intelligence on German movements. The Soviets knew exactly where Wiking was positioned. They knew how many operational tanks it had, roughly 40 to 50, mostly Panzer IVs with some Panthers. Most critically, they understood how logistically fragile the entire salient had become. By late January, everything was in position. Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front deployed south of the Bulge with the 4th Guards Army, 5th Guards Tank Army, and 52nd Army. Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian Front moved from the north with the 6th Tank Army and 27th Army. The jaws of an enormous trap were opening. German commanders inside the salient were about to discover they'd walked into a meticulously prepared killing ground. The first warnings came in fragments, scattered radio transmissions from panicked forward units, Soviet armor appearing in sectors where no Soviet armor should exist. Then the trickle became a torrent. By the evening of January 28, 1944, German commanders inside the pocket confronted a nightmare scenario. Marshal Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front and General Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian Front had executed their double envelopment with devastating precision. Soviet forces had sliced through weakened German positions and now formed an unbroken ring around roughly 56,000 trapped soldiers. The 4th Guards Army, 5th Guards Cavalry Corps, 52nd Army, 5th Guards Tank Army, 6th Tank Army, and 27th Army, all converging. Inside that ring sat the entire 11th Army Corps under General Wilhelm Stemmermann, the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, the 72nd, 88th, 389th, 57th, and 167th Infantry Divisions, as well as scattered remnants of the 1st and 16th Panzer Divisions. Artillery positions had been overrun. Supply convoys were ambushed. Roads had been severed by Soviet armor, moving with terrifying speed to seal every escape route. But what defined the German response in those first critical days was denial. SS Brigade Führer Herbert Giller commanded Wiking, while General Stemmermann commanded the entire trapped force. Both men genuinely believed they could maintain a defensive perimeter until relief forces reached them. This wasn't irrational. It was based on recent precedent. The Demyansk pocket in 1942 had been supplied by air and eventually relieved. Surely the same could happen here. Soviet commanders understood differently. While German officers studied maps and calculated ammunition supplies, Soviet forces were already positioning artillery batteries and deploying armor at every potential breakout corridor. Intercepted German radio traffic revealed exact defensive positions and supply status. Soviet intelligence had been reading German communications throughout the operation. The Soviets weren't simply containing the pocket, they were systematically preparing to annihilate it. By early February, reality began penetrating German optimism. Luftwaffe supply drops were failing. Soviet air superiority and savage winter weather meant most desperately needed supplies never reached their targets. Fuel reserves collapsed. Food rations shrank to starvation levels. The pocket was contracting too. Soviet attacks compressed the perimeter day after day. Relief remained uncertain at best, and with each passing hour, the frozen Ukrainian steppe was transforming from a temporary defensive position into something far worse. A prison where 56,000 men would face starvation, frostbite, and the mounting certainty of annihilation. Inside a cramped command bunker, flickering candlelight illuminated a mud-stained map of the Korsun pocket. Two men bent over it, calculating odds that grew worse by the hour. SS Brigade Führer Herbert Giller, commander of the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, traced possible escape routes with his finger. General Wilhelm Stemmermann carried ultimate responsibility for all 56,000 trapped men of the 11th Army Corps. He counted resources that diminished daily: fuel for perhaps 40 operational tanks, food rations reduced to starvation quantities, and ammunition stocks insufficient to repel another major Soviet assault. Every calculation pointed to the same inescapable conclusion: they were running out of time. Every decision they made would determine whether thousands of men lived or died. Gniloy had built his reputation on tactical brilliance, the kind of commander who could read a battlefield and exploit weaknesses others overlooked. But tactical genius meant nothing without fuel to maneuver tanks or ammunition to sustain defense. He coordinated constantly with other trapped division commanders, struggling to maintain some combat effectiveness while Soviet artillery methodically crushed their perimeter. His division, once considered elite, was being systematically strangled. Stemmermann faced an even more impossible burden. Archival records reveal a man torn between competing demands. Orders from Army Group South demanded they hold positions and await relief forces that might never arrive. Yet his own letters document growing private doubts about whether relief was even possible. Radio intercepts showed the Soviets reinforcing their encirclement faster than German relief columns could advance. Should they conserve remaining fuel and ammunition for defense, or gamble everything on an immediate breakout while they still had strength to fight? The tension between commanders crystallized around one brutal question: when? Break out too early, and they'd abandon wounded men and equipment that relief forces might still save. Wait too long, and they'd be too weak to break through at all. Stemmermann's messages to higher command grew increasingly urgent, seeking authorization for action even as he watched his corps being systematically destroyed. His final transmission would cut through all strategic ambiguity with 3 words that captured their desperation: breakout at all costs. While Gniloy and Stemmermann wrestled with impossible choices inside the pocket, the men orchestrating their destruction operated with absolute clarity of purpose. Marshal Konev and General Vatutin weren't merely trying to destroy another German corps. They intended to make Korsun-Cherkassy an unmistakable demonstration of Soviet operational superiority, a turning point that would accelerate Ukraine's liberation. Proof that the Red Army had mastered the art of encirclement that had once devastated their own forces. But their intelligence painted a sobering picture. The trapped force included the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, elite troops with combat experience stretching back to 1941. 6 battle-hardened infantry divisions, elements of 2 panzer divisions, roughly 56,000 men who wouldn't surrender without a fight. Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front and Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian Front had executed the double envelopment brilliantly. They'd deployed the 4th Guards Army, 5th Guards Cavalry Corps, 5th Guards Tank Army, and 6th Tank Army to seal the pocket. But sealing it was one thing, keeping it sealed against a coordinated breakout attempt was another. Soviet command documents reveal something triumphant post-war narratives often omit: genuine anxiety. Heated debates erupted over reserve allocation. Which escape routes required reinforcement? Could they maintain the encirclement if German relief forces broke through from outside while trapped units attacked from within? The operation was far from a foregone conclusion. This was February 1944, not 1941. Soviet operational coordination had evolved dramatically since the war's catastrophic opening years. Konev and Vatutin demonstrated unprecedented cooperation between 2 separate front commands, sharing intelligence from intercepted German radio traffic and coordinating artillery strikes for maximum effect. They understood the strategic prize. Destroying Army Group South's combat power here would open the road to Western Ukraine and beyond. Korsun-Cherkassy had to be more than a tactical victory. It had to be a killing ground that would shatter German offensive capability in the South forever. But achieving that goal would cost them dearly. Soviet forces would ultimately suffer an estimated 20 to 25,000 casualties, containing the pocket and repelling breakout attempts. The intensity of German resistance, desperate men fighting for survival, would test Soviet resolve at every turn. As artillery bombardments pounded German positions day and night, and February's brutal cold settled over the battlefield, the Soviets tightened their grip. Inside the pocket, the encircled troops now faced an enemy more implacable than Soviet tanks, the logistical death spiral that would determine their fate. Soldiers craned their necks at the sound of engines, Junkers Ju-52 transports laboring through grey February skies. For the encircled men of Wiking and 11th Army Corps, these aircraft represented their only lifeline. But as parachutes blossomed and supply containers tumbled earthward, desperate hope transformed into horror. Soviet fighters tore through the formations. The few containers that made it through drifted on winter winds into Soviet-controlled territory. Others slammed into frozen ground, splitting apart and scattering their precious contents across the snow. Ammunition crates shattered. Medical supplies got buried in drifts. Food was trampled into ice. This was the brutal mathematics of encirclement. Once the Soviet trap closed on January 28th, resupply could only be attempted by air. But Soviet air superiority and Ukraine's notoriously harsh winter weather turned Luftwaffe efforts into a cruel lottery. Most supply drops fell catastrophically short of requirements, and many never reached German lines at all. The shortages documented in field reports paint a picture of systematic strangulation. Fuel became so scarce that Wiking's roughly 40 to 50 operational tanks sat immobilized within days. Mostly Panzer IV H and J models, along with a handful of Panthers and some Stu G3s, all reduced to stationary pillboxes as their crews watched fuel gauges drop to empty. Food rations collapsed to starvation levels. Men who'd once received adequate field rations now survived on scraps, their bodies weakening from malnutrition, even as fighting intensified. Medical supplies ran out as casualties mounted. Doctors operated without anesthesia, and bandages were reused. Communications equipment failed or was destroyed by Soviet artillery. Radio sets fell silent. Field telephone lines were severed. Entire units simply vanished from the command network. Gniloy and Stemmermann lost contact with battalions, unable to coordinate defense or organize relief. The cold became an enemy as implacable as the Red Army. February temperatures plunged far below freezing. Without fuel for fires or vehicles, frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Soldiers huddled in frozen trenches, watching their equipment fail around them, tank engines that wouldn't start, weapons that jammed, and vehicles abandoned where they stood for lack of fuel or spare parts. This wasn't defeat by enemy action alone. This was an army being strangled, its combat effectiveness bleeding away with every passing hour as the pocket tightened and the skies remained empty of meaningful relief. Inside a frozen foxhole on February 10, 1944, SS Unterscharführer Karl-Heinz Bosser scratched a few lines into his diary by the light of a guttering candle stub. "We use the frozen bodies of our comrades as windbreaks," he wrote, his handwriting barely legible. "The hunger gnaws constantly. At night we whisper about home. Will we ever see it again?" These weren't the words of a fanatical ideologue. They were the desperate confession of a man watching his world collapse one frozen hour at a time. Daily reality inside the Korsun pocket bore no resemblance to the propaganda image of elite SS warriors. Danish volunteer Knud Berger Martinson's letters home, never delivered, described men reduced to scavenging horse meat from dead animals and boiling leather belts for something, anything, to fill their stomachs. The extreme cold claimed as many casualties as Soviet shells. Soldiers with frostbitten fingers couldn't pull triggers. Men with frozen feet couldn't march. The camaraderie that supposedly defined Wiking began fracturing under the weight of impossible suffering. For foreign volunteers especially, the pocket became a crucible of doubt. These men had joined believing they were defending Western civilization against Bolshevism. Now they huddled in frozen trenches, isolated by language barriers and cultural tensions, even from their German comrades. As casualties mounted, some questioned whether their commitment had been worth it. Wiking would ultimately lose around 1,000 killed and thousands more wounded from its roughly 15,000 men. The myth of fanatical unity dissolved in the face of starvation and abandonment. The suffering wasn't distributed equally. German officers like Herbert Gniloy faced crushing pressure to make life or death decisions with incomplete intelligence and dwindling resources. Foreign volunteers wrestled with existential questions about loyalty and purpose. But the rank-and-file soldiers, German and foreign alike, suffered most acutely. Many felt abandoned as they watched February skies remain empty of relief forces, forced to endure conditions that pushed human endurance beyond its limits. Desperation bred improvisation. Viking engineers began cannibalizing destroyed vehicles, building makeshift rafts and sleds to move mounting numbers of wounded. Soldiers scavenged captured Soviet anti-tank guns and rifles when their own ammunition ran out. Officers who'd once commanded Panthers and Panzer IVs now led men armed with whatever they could carry. And slowly, terribly, the realization set in. No relief was coming. The only way out was through Soviet lines, across a frozen river, and into the guns waiting on the other side. On the horizon, German soldiers watched, distant flashes, artillery and tank fire lighting up winter darkness like a deadly thunderstorm. Relief forces were out there. Panzer divisions from 3rd Panzer Corps were fighting desperately to break through Soviet lines and reach the pocket. Men strained their eyes toward those flashes, calculating distances and whispering prayers. Then, night after night, came the terrible silence. The flashes grew fainter, pushed back by Soviet counterattacks. Finally, they disappeared altogether. The relief forces had failed. Outside the pocket, German armoured units including the 1st, 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions launched multiple attempts to punch through Soviet defences in early February. They came within 15 kilometers of the encircled troops, close enough that trapped men could hear the distant rumble of their guns. But Marshal Konev had anticipated this, deploying fresh reserves and anti-tank positions that turned each relief attempt into a bloodbath. The panzers were beaten back, their tanks burning in the snow, their infantry pinned down by artillery fire that never seemed to stop. Inside the pocket, Herbert Gniloy and Wilhelm Stemmermann faced an impossible choice. Archival letters between the two commanders document their growing desperation and fundamental disagreement. Stemmermann wanted to wait. Surely another relief attempt would succeed. Surely the Luftwaffe would increase supply drops. Surely holding out a few more days would bring salvation. Gniloy, watching his division disintegrate from starvation and cold, argued for immediate breakout while they still possessed some combat capability. Every day they waited, fuel reserves dwindled further. Ammunition stocks shrank. More men died from wounds that could have been treated in proper hospitals. By mid-February, the question had answered itself. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Artillery batteries rationed shells, counting rounds for a final barrage. Fuel was gone. The 40 operational tanks Wiking had started with now sat as frozen monuments, stripped for parts. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Field hospitals were packed with wounded who screamed through the night while surgeons operated by candlelight without proper anesthesia. And Soviet pressure intensified daily, probing attacks, testing German lines, tightening the noose. On February 16, 1944, Stemmermann sent his final message, breakout at all costs. That night, orders passed down through frozen, exhausted units. Abandon all vehicles, abandon heavy weapons, take only what you can carry, a rifle, ammunition, and one day's rations if you have them. Form up in assault columns. During the night of February 16th to 17th, we charged through Soviet lines toward the Gniloy Tikich River. There's a German bridgehead on the far side. Get there or die trying. In the early hours of February 17th, 1944, signal flares arced into the black winter sky above the Korsun-Cherkassy pocket. All along the German perimeter, thousands of exhausted men rose from frozen foxholes and began moving toward the Gniloy Tikich River. They carried only rifles and whatever ammunition they could scavenge. Behind them lay every tank, every artillery piece, and every vehicle abandoned in the snow for lack of fuel. Ahead lay 3 kilometers of open ground and a frozen river valley where Soviet forces waited in prepared positions. The moment the first German columns emerged from the tree line, Soviet artillery opened fire. Katyusha rockets screamed overhead. Tracers from machine gun positions stitched red lines across the snow. Within minutes, the pristine white landscape transformed into a killing field. Men fell in waves. The snow turned red. SS Brigade Führer Herbert Gniloy, already wounded but refusing evacuation, led elements of Wiking forward. Beside him, General Wilhelm Stemmermann directed the 11th Army Corps in its final desperate assault. Survivors would later describe the terror of that charge. Thousands of men running, stumbling, and crawling through knee-deep snow, while Soviet tanks emerged from concealed positions along the riverbank, firing directly into the massed formations. The Gniloy Tikich River valley became a slaughterhouse. Those who reached the river found it partially frozen and partially flowing with icy water. Men waded through chest-deep currents, dragging wounded comrades and abandoning those too injured to move. Soviet tanks pursued them to the water's edge. Soviet accounts describe tank crews charging into German lines at enormous risk, attempting to block escape corridors. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted atop disabled vehicles. The emotional toll on Soviet soldiers witnessing such carnage was profound. One guardsman later wrote that the river valley was strewn with bodies as far as the eye could see. General Stemmermann was killed directing the assault, cut down by Soviet fire while trying to organize his disintegrating corps. Gniloy, bleeding and barely conscious, continued leading survivors across the river. Of the roughly 20,000 German soldiers killed during the entire Korsun-Cherkassy operation, many died in that river valley during the final breakout. Another 18,000 were captured, most of them wounded men left behind in overwhelmed field hospitals. The Wiking Division lost approximately 1,000 killed and up to 2,000 missing, its combat strength reduced by more than half in a single night. As dawn broke on February 17th, the river valley revealed its full horror. A frozen tableau of corpses, abandoned equipment, and scattered survivors stumbling westward through the snow. Exhausted survivors staggered into German lines. Officers began the grim task of counting who remained. Units that had marched into the pocket with thousands of men now mustered in the hundreds. Company commanders called out names to scattered groups of hollow-eyed soldiers, desperately searching for their men among the exhausted refugees stumbling through the snow. The accounting, when it finally came together, revealed the full scale of catastrophe. Of roughly 56,000 German troops trapped in the Korsun-Cherkassy pocket, the operation had cost about 20,000 killed. Another 10,000 wounded had made it out, but would never fight again. Perhaps most devastating were the 18,000 captured, the majority wounded men left behind in overwhelmed field hospitals when the breakout began. Now they were prisoners facing an uncertain fate in Soviet captivity. For the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, the elite formation that had once been Hitler's showcase of pan-European anti-communist unity, the numbers told a story of complete destruction. The division suffered. Roughly 1,000 killed, several thousand wounded, and up to 2,000 missing or captured. Its combat strength had been reduced by 40 to 60% in a single night. But casualty figures alone didn't capture the full devastation. Every single piece of heavy equipment had been abandoned in the pocket. The roughly 40 to 50 tanks Wiking had fielded at the start, Panzer IVs, Panthers, and Stu G3s, now sat silent in the snow, out of fuel or broken down, left as trophies for Soviet forces. Every artillery piece, every transport vehicle, and every supply truck was gone. The division that staggered back to German lines was essentially an infantry force, stripped of the armor and firepower that had made it effective. Even Soviet victory had come at terrible cost. Soviet forces suffered an estimated 20 to 25,000 casualties containing and crushing the breakout, testament to the desperation and ferocity of German resistance. The frozen earth around Korsun-Cherkassy had consumed soldiers from both sides with equal brutality, a reminder that on the Eastern Front, even winning could feel like losing. But as German commanders tallied their losses and tried to rebuild shattered units, larger questions loomed. What did this disaster mean for the war itself? For the foreign volunteers who survived? What did it mean to have sacrificed so much for a cause now clearly losing? And for the nations that had sent their sons to fight in Hitler's crusade? Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands, as well as Belgium. How would they reckon with this blood debt when the war finally ended? They came back hollow-eyed and frostbitten, thousands of survivors staggering into German lines, with the haunted look of men who'd witnessed something beyond comprehension in that frozen river valley. The 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking was pulled back to refit, but everyone knew the truth. This elite division would never recover. Of the foreign volunteers who survived, many faced a crisis of faith that no amount of anti-communist ideology could answer. The river crossing had stripped away the romantic veneer of their crusade, leaving only corpses in the snow and the terrible question: had any of it been worth the price? But there were other victims whose suffering appears in no official casualty count. Local Ukrainian civilians caught in the encirclement endured looting, displacement, and violence from both sides. German troops desperate for food ransacked villages. Soviet forces, viewing locals as potential collaborators, showed little mercy. These civilians represent the forgotten human cost beyond the combatants. Families torn apart, homes destroyed, and lives shattered in the crossfire of ideological warfare. Among the survivors was Danish officer Knud Børge Martinsen. His last-ditch counterattack with a handful of volunteers had bought precious time for hundreds to escape. He survived the river crossing, but liberation would bring its own reckoning. In post-war Denmark, service in the Waffen-SS meant trials, imprisonment, and social ostracism. Martinsen's story embodied the impossible position of foreign volunteers, celebrated as heroes by their SS comrades, condemned as traitors by their countrymen. The Soviet perspective reveals its own complexities. Guardsman Ivan Petrov's account describes not triumphant victory, but the emotional toll of witnessing the carnage, the river valley strewn with bodies, the screams of wounded men freezing in the darkness. Soviet soldiers had their own nightmares about Korsun-Cherkassy, their own questions about the human cost of stopping the German breakout. These accounts humanize the Soviet experience beyond propaganda, showing soldiers grappling with the moral weight of total war. For the civilians, there would be no medals, no memoirs, and no recognition. They simply tried to survive, caught between armies that viewed them as either resources to exploit or obstacles to eliminate. Their displacement, their losses, and their trauma became footnotes in a military history obsessed with tactical maneuvers and casualty counts. The survivors carried Korsun-Cherkassy with them forever, in frostbitten limbs that never healed properly, in nightmares that replayed the river crossing, and in the knowledge that they'd witnessed something that would be remembered, forgotten, and weaponized differently across a divided post-war Europe. How that memory was shaped depended entirely on where the survivors returned. In Russia and Ukraine, the battle became Korsun-Cherkassy, a celebrated liberation victory marked by monuments and annual commemorations. It stood as proof that Soviet forces had mastered the operational art of encirclement. For Moscow, this was vindication. Roughly 56,000 German troops had been trapped, 20,000 killed, and 18,000 captured. It was a tactical demonstration that the Red Army could now execute the same devastating double envelopments that had once threatened their own survival at Kiev and Vyazma. The battle reinforced patriotic narratives about the Great Patriotic War, marking a turning point in reclaiming Ukrainian territory from fascist occupation. In Western Europe, the story was silence and shame. Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway, the nations whose young men had volunteered for Wiking, faced uncomfortable reckonings. Post-war governments condemned the volunteers as collaborators and traitors, leading to trials, imprisonment, and social ostracism that would last decades. Danish officer Knud Berger Martinsen, who'd led that desperate counterattack buying time for hundreds to escape, returned home to face prosecution. The experience was suppressed in national memory, a dark chapter that contradicted post-war narratives of resistance and liberation. In Germany itself, Korsun-Cherkassy became part of the tragic Eastern Front narrative, acknowledged but rarely commemorated. The Waffen-SS's divisive legacy, its documented association with war crimes and collaboration with genocide, made public remembrance impossible. The myth of Wiking as elite warriors defending European civilization against Bolshevism collapsed under the weight of evidence. Tactical performance couldn't erase moral culpability. The division's destruction in that frozen pocket revealed the hollowness of SS mythology. Contemporary military scholarship draws uncomfortable comparisons. Stalingrad had trapped over 300,000 German troops in a months-long siege synonymous with total annihilation. Korsun-Cherkassy was smaller, 56,000 encircled versus 300,000, but tactically similar. It demonstrated that by 1944, Soviet forces had perfected the operational art that would carry them to Berlin. The partial breakout at Korsun, unlike Stalingrad's total surrender, offered no comfort. The human cost was proportionally just as devastating, and the material losses just as catastrophic. Today, the Gniloy Tikich River Valley is peaceful farmland. Few markers commemorate what happened on that February night in 1944. Crops grow where thousands died in icy water, fighting for a cause that had already lost, in a war that would consume millions more before its end. The silence is almost complete, except for the questions that linger about what men will endure and what they will believe when ideology collides with the brutal mathematics of modern war. The Korsun-Cherkassy pocket stands as a brutal demonstration of how the Eastern Front had evolved by 1944. Soviet operational superiority had surpassed German tactical excellence. No amount of ideological conviction could compensate for strategic overextension and logistical collapse. The river valley at Gniloy Tikich, where thousands died in a single desperate night, became a monument to the horrific human cost of ideological warfare. A frozen hell where the myth of SS invincibility drowned in icy water alongside the bodies of true believers from across Europe. If you found this story compelling, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.